Ready? Mike, is that on now? Okay, apologies everyone for the delay. We're getting our PowerPoint slides in order. And we have a series of actions pending, obviously, this morning, and I'll let Dr. Wilson walk us through those.
Thank you, Chair. So we have 9 actions remaining for this, the 96th session of the IPHC annual meeting. Those are now shown on the screen, and the intention is to walk through those to reach agreement or otherwise, and to document that into the report. We're going to walk briefly through the management strategy evaluation, objectives and management procedure recommendations from the MSAB for your potential consideration, the rules of procedure amendments for 2020, the commercial fishing period element, which is outstanding. We're then going to walk through your decisions and recommendations for mortality limits before rounding out with a number of administrative elements, such as the media release, the election of chairperson and vice chairperson for the next year, publication of the fishery regulations, and then finally the process for adoption of the report of the meeting. So we'll commence and step through those. The first is the management strategy evaluation process, and there were a number of recommendations and requested actions from the MSAB and also the IPHC Secretariat that were provided. At this point, we're just seeking confirmation of your desired action on how to handle that process moving forward. The summary of the discussions from the last few days has been that you have been noting those recommendations coming from the MSAB, and for you now to provide direction on how you'd like us to proceed. And so before I jump to those slides, I will leave it for commissioners to respond. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Davis.
Thanks. I think we've heard a lot of the continued good work from the MSAB in this past year, and I, for one, am encouraged by the progress that they've made on a number of fronts, and would like to thank all of the participants in that process, both from the Secretariat and from the 2 contracting parties. I think I'd like to put a motion forward for the Commission to note the recommendations that the MSAB has made to the Commissioners, with the suggestion that we hold an intersessional meeting in the near future to provide direction on the recommendations that the MSAB has made.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any further comments to the motion or questions on the motion? Seeing none, and I believe there's concurrence around the table. Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Chair. The next item is the IPHC Rules of Procedure 2020. You will recall that the Finance and Administration Committee and also the Conference Board reviewed the amendments to the 2019 Rules of Procedure. The Conference Board made 3 recommended improvements to their Rules of Procedure, and those have been provided to you. And including through the presentation of the Conference Board meeting report yesterday. And the Finance Administration Committee also recommended changes, 2 changes to the roles and functions of the Executive Director and the Assistant Director, which you've also reviewed. And so, Chair, with those 5 total amendments, we're seeking consensus approval of the updated Rules of Procedure. Thank you, Chair.
looking for a motion to approve, or is that a concurrence? Let's see if there's any questions or comments from fellow commissioners. Seeing none, Mr. Davis.
Well, I can make a motion to adopt the changes to the rules of procedure that have been proposed.
Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Alverson. Any discussion on the motion to adopt? Rules of procedure. Seeing none, motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So the Commission has adopted the revised rules of procedure 2020 by consensus, and subsequently to that, the follow-on is that we'll finalize those and publish them accordingly. So thank you very much. Next on the agenda is the final element of the commercial fishing period. You have adopted the 2A components for the 3-day fishing period, and at this point the only remaining element is for the rest of the commercial fishing for Pacific halibut in all IPHC regulatory areas. And Assistant Director Steve, did you want to make any additional comments on that? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. No, that's the last remaining part of the our proposal A2, which had to do with fishing periods, and this is, as Dr. Wilson just said, applies to commercial fishing in all IPHC regulatory areas, the start and stop time for the year.
Entertain a motion.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would move that our commercial fishing period opening date be March 14th and our closing date be the same as it is, which I believe is November 15th.
Seconded by Mr. DeGree. Would you speak to the motion, or are there any questions for the motion?
So, Mr. Chair, I have following comments. I didn't hear a lot of discussion, but I know that on the U.S. side, with significantly increasing sablefish quotas, these opening dates and closing dates for us are tied together. And it's becoming increasingly important for the U.S. side to see an earlier opening date to catch both species. And it adds to the avoidance of sperm whales, I know, in Southeast earlier in the season. And so I'd like to have the staff coordinate with NIMS to see if we were to set up a season such as the first Friday in March, if that addresses the ability for the U.S. side to populate the guys, the people, the harvest cards, the quotas in a timely fashion. And maybe we can have that input in our meeting or sometime around in the fall. Those are my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Other comments? Mr. DeGree.
Yes, just speaking to what Bob mentioned, I know a lot of Canadian industry would like to see extended openings, longer seasons, just for bycatch and yeah.
Further comments? Is there any objection to this motion? Seeing none, it passes.
Thank you, Chair. The next item is the mortality limits. And so before we bring up any other slides, we'll just add those dates for the commercial fishing periods. So for everybody's viewing, so the 14th of March and 15th of November. So as I said, the next item on the agenda is the decision for the Commission on mortality limits.
So, Mr. Chair, we're going to have a slide up there. Do you? Okay. So, Mr. Chair, I make the following motion with regards to TCEY limits. So those, instead of mortality limits, be TCEY limits. For Area 2A, it would be 1,650,000 pounds. For Canada, it would be 6,830,000 pounds. For 2C, 5,850,000 pounds. For 3A, 12,200,000 pounds. 3B, 3,120,000 pounds. 4A, 1,750,000 pounds. For Bravo, 1,310,000 pounds. 1,310. And then 4C, D, and E would be 3,900,000 pounds. The total I show is 36,600,000. If I get a second, I will speak to that.
Seconded by Mr. Davis.
Mr. Chair, this is an encompassing motion for all of our regulatory areas, and beginning in Area 2A at the 1,650,000 pounds. This incorporates our treaty nation commitment for another intending to go for 4 years. This would be the second season of that. I would caution, however, at the end of the 4 years that we'll be looking very seriously at what the survey and catch per unit of effort is. It fortunately on the commercial side and on the survey, we're both up in that area this year, but the overall harvest rate exceeds what our normal recommendations would be. So I just put a caution that it will be seriously reviewed at the end of our agreement. In Area 2B, this harvest limit includes a 50% accounting for U26. Is intended to go for the duration of our agreement, which would be 3 this season plus 2 more. And it is my understanding that the staff will be providing additional scientific evaluation of that U26 to help us complete our discussion on that subject matter. 2C, the harvest limit proposed in the motion is approximately 8% below last year. It could be even further. However, we were compelled with the arguments on the negative socioeconomic impacts on the charter fleet in that area, and 5,850,000 pounds is a benchmark in U.S. regs, and so that significantly drove us to that number. With regards to the 12,200,000 in 3A, yes, 3A, this is a reduction from the 13,500,000, so almost a 10%, maybe a little better reduction. And again, the 12,200,000 is a benchmark in U.S. regs for the charter boat industry. Had it gone below that amount, they would have been closed for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday on a 1 fish bag limit. So that was a compelling issue there. However, I put another warning there that should the resource continue to deteriorate, that I'm not sure we can hold that line in 2021, but hopefully the surveys come in either showing a stability or an increasing trend next year. In 3B, the harvest limit of 303,120,000 pounds. There is a series of slides I asked the staff to provide on this. I'm not sure there. So the survey trends in 3B, as you can see, came up last year quite a bit. We drove the harvest down to 2,900,000 pounds last year based on a significant reduction. The fishery trends tended to follow this year. The survey trends, I think they were up 44% on the fishery slide. And you can see on the fishery side, which I'm drawn to, that this year's numbers are similar to, if you throw the outlier last year out, to the previous 3 years. And though there's no way to get back to the 3,270,000 from 2018 because the overall fishery resources declined, but the Elwoods who testified, I think, made a good case for the 3B people in that area, and that's and the increase, I think, is reflective of what's going on, particularly with the fishery trends. 4A and 4B fishery trends, you can see they were significantly down in 4B and 4A. They continued to decline. There's a 3-year decline. The survey trends, if we could flip back to that chart as well, they show an up in 4A, but it's still the second lowest number we've seen. 4A is not catching their harvest limit the last couple of years. In fact, it's in the 80 percentile, I think, and 4B is in the 70 percentile. You can see we're at the lowest number in 4B. So both those areas got a 10% reduction to begin to reflect these negative rating, both in the fishery and the survey results. In 4C D&E, there is I want to thank the Canadians for accepting a 3-year average of our bycatch in that area. Though I would caution that though this year it gives a benefit in that area as the TCEY is down 10,000 or 100,000 pounds, but the FCEY will be at, I'm showing 1,730,000. So it meets a need in that area that allows 4E to have their allocation. However, I caution again that averages, the only reason that it happens is 2 out of the 3 years are lower than this year. So if there's an increase next year, the averages can start to erode the advantage that we have in 4CD this year. So, Mr. Chair, that completes my comments for all these areas. I know others have comments as well.
Thank you for the motion, and I have a number of comments, but I'm going to look to other commissioners first. Mr. DeGreef.
Thank you, Bob. I'm not going to be able to support this motion for a couple of reasons. The first is principle. There's always an excuse to back out of any agreement. An agreement is about trust and good faith. The 2019 agreement was about 3 long-standing issues for Canada. They were apportionment, bycatch, and improved monitoring. Sorry. Since the coastwide assessment began, Canada has disagreed with the apportionment. The model apportioned too much stock to the west. The metrics on the more rapidly decreasing biomass to the west illustrate that. During our negotiations last year, Canada wanted a defined share. It was based on a 5-year history. Also on bycatch, after over 20 years, Canada realized and were flat out told it could not slow down the machine that drives bycatch. We were told how the U.S. kills its halibut is the U.S.'s business. Canada wanted to be made whole by this lost opportunity, thus bycatch mitigation. It was structured to be incentive-based. The more the US cuts their bycatch, the less mitigation it has to pay to Canada. Canada also wanted a work plan for bycatch reduction and improved monitoring. These were clear and well understood by all commissioners. We made an agreement. Canada compromised and agreed to a formula rather than a distinct share. This meant Canada took a cut when our survey was up and the stock was thought to be positive. We agreed to 100% bycatch mitigation in 2020 after Dr. Stewart's paper was to be peer reviewed by SRB. A work plan and what it would contain were for future discussions. Not getting to the letter of agreement means trust was eroded. However, the main reason I cannot support this year's agreement is that at F42, the fishing intensity is too aggressive. When I was first appointed, my father told me one thing: take care of the stock and the stock will take care of you. Since coming to meetings in place of my father, excuse me, his first questions were always, what did the survey do and how was the stock? Secondary was always, what was our allocation? I came here expecting to take a cut like everyone else, except for 2A and the factory trawlers. The trajectory of the stock is clear. With a relative spawning biomass of 32, we are teetering on the ramp. If we do not take cuts soon, in 3 years, we have a 1 in 5 chance of below a relative spawning biomass of under 20. That is a full stop for everyone but factory trawlers. When I hear about cliffs around regulations, I am concerned. This is no way to manage a resource. I cannot agree to an F42 as I do not believe I would be doing the one thing my father asked me to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeGrief. Mr. Yamato.
Yes, I too will not be supporting this motion. And the major, there's several reasons, but the one of the major ones is that my understanding from last year's agreement was that we would intend to look at the U26 component and interpreted that as not a commitment to actually involve that adjustment this year. And knowing that the landscape of the stock really changed with the new science, I felt it was an appropriate time to really take action on this. But further than that, you know, the formula that we use to look at the U26 component and its distribution throughout the regions came from Dr. Stewart's paper, and no disrespect for Dr. Stewart, but it is one view of how we could formulate the distribution. And given what we had at the time, Dr. Stewart gave us one perspective. And I really feel that that perspective was mathematically done without a lot of consideration to the migration or the biological nature of U26 and how it might generally move throughout the region. And I was anticipating that process would be further analyzed by the MSAB to give us a better idea about U26. So I didn't think that using the formula this year to even arrive at a half adjustment for potential U-26 for Canada was appropriate. And thirdly, I think the fact that by agreeing to these terms of U-26, the recognition of the U-26 and a formulaic way of using that might memorialize an understanding that maybe the United States does not agree upon. I think historically we've been using historic actions, the way we respond and have negotiated in the past, like the 20% allocation in past years, has been used as an argument to justify future movement in our negotiations. So I felt that if we adopted this concept of U-26 adjustments, or the Canadians are calling mitigation, that would interfere in our negotiation in the future, because the United States has always felt that allocation should be done scientifically through the information we get from the surveys, and there might be some additional adjustments for socio and economic adjustments, but the amount of difference between that and what Canada has been getting has been unacceptable. And so in order to prevent adding more fuel to the fire in the future, I cannot in all good conscience agree to the way we've adjusted that U-26 in this agreement. So that's the major reasons why I'm not going to vote in support of this catch limits based upon that, the way we're handling U-26. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yamada. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to make just a few comments. While I share my fellow Canadian Commissioners' concerns about some elements of where we have arrived this year, I intend to support this motion, primarily because I see it as important progress in addressing some of the things that have been important for Canada for many, many years, particularly with respect to bycatch and addressing its impacts. These discussions go back to the beginning of the 1990s. So taking the long view, I think these are steps forward that address some of those issues that have been so important to Canada for so long. And I like to think that in the longer term, that progress on those issues will benefit all directed harvesters in all regulatory areas. And on that note, I think my other observation is that at a certain point in the discussions this week, we were referring to this as a salvage operation amongst the Canadian Commissioners in terms of trying to find a path forward that would preserve as much of the agreement we reached last year as possible, while also addressing some of the concerns that our U.S. counterparts had raised, and trying to maintain a constructive working relationship that I think this treaty and the past 96 years have been based on, and that are so important for us to be able to continue working together moving forward. My last comment is just that while this year's discussions were difficult in many respects, I think the next few years look like they will be even more difficult. And I think it's important for all of us to bear that in mind, and to recognize that that is almost certain, or potentially means that there will be difficult decisions about the scope of fishing opportunities that may lie ahead. And with that in mind, I think Canada's perspective is certainly that we believe in sharing the conservation burden associated with managing a resource responsibly. Hence our focus on a share rather than a fixed amount. And And I appreciate the perspectives that both Commissioner Yamada and DeGrief have raised. I think I'm hopeful that all of those perspectives can be sort of included in a constructive working relationship moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Other comments from commissioners? Go ahead, Mr. Ryall.
Well, I would say I will support the motion. It was a very challenging decision to come to, and I won't repeat many of the things that Commissioner Davis just spoke to. But I would say I agree with what he did say, and for the reasons that he spoke to them. So over the course of time that I've been on the commission, I would just reiterate coming to a conclusion on how to move forward on this was very challenging. And I know it was for all of us. However, I do think it is the right decision at this time to agree to what's being proposed. We had very constructive discussion here, in my view, on the course over the last number of days over all the issues that were raised by my fellow commissioners. But as Commissioner Davis identified, if you look at the trajectory of the stock and the probability of being below 30%, it's basically a 50-50 probability at this point. Hopefully, when we're here in a year from now, that we're proven that there are some more recruits coming into the population. I guess I am, and after much discussion around the setline survey for this year, we have made additional investment, I would say, in that setline survey to ensure that we get the best information that we can to make a decision next year, which was one of my driving interest in seeing more stations undertaken this year. So that there wouldn't be a debate about, well, we didn't have enough stations or the actual structure of it was not quite correct, and we'd have a debate about that. So at least from my point of view, we will have improved, or maybe not improved, but we'll have very good information to make our decisions next year. But to close, I will just reiterate that I will be supporting the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Ryall, and I will also support the motion. I have some concerns with it I'll speak to. I share the concerns that were raised by Mr. Yamada, but I want to address a few points in order, I guess. The overall F42, I also share some of the hesitation that was expressed by Mr. DeGrief with that aggressive of a harvest rate in light of the state of the resource. However, it is well within the range of F rates that have been recommended as safe by our Science Review Board, by the MSAB. I would note that, and I believe Mr. Ryall noted this, that the anticipated trajectory of the stock, when you look at an F42 versus a 3 or a 4, is the difference in the trajectory is fairly negligible. And I think that at that rate that we've chosen, it allows us, certainly on the U.S. side, to meet some fairly critical thresholds for our fishery from a management and policy perspective. And those include, as Mr. Alverson alluded to, some significant charter fishery considerations in 2C and 3A, our basic prosecution of a fishery in area 4C, D, and E. And so notwithstanding a little bit of discomfort, I'm supportive of that aspect. I do support the use of the 3-year bycatch running average. I think that is a more fair and consistent using a rolling average to smooth out the impacts of that. That it can cut both ways. I think in the case of this year, it makes a fairly significant difference in the positive for area 4C, D, and E. And again, as Mr. Albertson pointed out, depending on how that unfolds this year, it may not be as advantageous, but I support it in principle. With regard to the 2A, 2B adjustments, those are what I agreed to. I continue to have some discomfort, as I did last year, with the formula that we agreed to for area 2B, because I believe it was too heavily weighted toward the 20% that they had achieved on average over the previous 5 years, as opposed to the actual survey biomass distribution apportionment. But that is what we agreed to for 2B and for 2A. And I guess I want to speak a little bit to the accounting for U-26 fish. And, you know, when we included that in our agreement last year, I said, and I still believe, just basically fundamentally philosophically, I agree with the premise that each party should be accountable for their removals. However, in the case, and we expressed an intent to go down that road, and intent does not necessarily equate to implementation in my view. I believe there was, based on all the uncertainty and all the questions that still surround that issue, I believe that we need a much more robust assessment of that, and we're going to be asking for that to be included within our MSE process and through the management, through the MSAB. And I believe that there was and I don't mean to speak for my Canadian counterparts, but they've, in our discussions this week, that was a very fundamental aspect of the agreement. They believe we should proceed with 100% accounting for that. I know our stakeholders and myself and other U.S. commissioners believe that we should withhold any implementation of it until we get that more robust assessment and a better understanding of how those U-26 fish flow through the system and what is the appropriate way to account for them. I hope that by the end of this 3-year agreement, we'll have that information, because we decided that a fair compromise was to do a 50% of the counting of that during the interim agreement, but only during the interim agreement. I believe that I, for one, don't see this as prejudicial or in any way memorializing that when we get to the end of that agreement. I think we start with a clean slate on that issue, as well as a clean slate on the 2A and the 2B formula issue. And so I just want to be clear on the record that despite my reservations, I thought it was in the best interest of this process to come to an agreement this year on our overall quotas. And that's why I'm going to support the motion. I would make, I guess, one other comment, and this sort of gets back to the formula for 2B. When you look at I know there's some probable dissatisfaction amongst U.S. stakeholders with this agreement, partly because of the agreement to do some accounting for the U-26 at this time. I also believe when you look at the result of our agreement, the U.S. collectively takes something around a 5% reduction relative to last year, whereas Canada does not take any reduction in the face of a declining resource. However, the reason for that, primary reason, except for a couple 100,000 pounds to do the U-26, is because the relative biomass distribution increased in area 2B relative to last year. And that formula is a double-edged sword too. It could go either way. In this particular case, it went up in the favor of Canada. And so I believe, while I still have reservations about that formula, it was what we agreed to, and that's what results from it. And so while optically, I agree with many stakeholders' concerns that it doesn't look good optically, I think it's in the best interest of this process, and it's a fair reflection of the agreement we made. So therefore, I will be supporting the motion. Are there other comments from Commissioner? Seeing none, I guess we would probably need a roll call vote on this, Mr. Wilson, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you through the chair. If the votes that I'm hearing around the table, it is that the motion is that the Commission adopt the distributed mortality limits for each contracting party by IPHC regulatory area as shown on the screen. And the understanding is that so far there's Canada in favor 2 against 1, U.S.A. in favor 2 against 1. Thank you, Chair.
And so we don't need a roll call, although those are we've all expressed our position. And with that, the motion passes. Thank you. Take a 1-minute stand down. Come back to order. I'm going to recognize Commissioner Davis. We have worked on language that reflects the underpinning of the agreement we made. And in the interest of transparency to the public and to make sure there's clear understanding of what we've agreed to and the rationale behind it, we've come up with which will essentially be report language coming out of this meeting. So I'll give the floor to you, Mr. Davis.
Okay, thank you. So what we've done is just taken the slide that you just saw, which describes the key elements of the agreement and reflected them in a series of statements here. These statements almost entirely simply roll over the content of our agreement last year with a few modifications that the commissioners have spoken about in the last 5 or 10 minutes here, specific to how we intend to implement this agreement moving forward. So the first is consistent with our agreement last year that we agreed to continue the development of a work plan to explore methods for improving monitoring requirements in directed and non-directed fisheries. Next slide. The next, which is also a rollover of what we had agreed to last year, is to continue work on how we incorporate all sources of mortality into the catch limits that we negotiate each year here. And so that language is consistent with what we had in the agreement and in the meeting report from AM095. Next slide. These paragraphs are modifications of the agreement we reached last year that relate to this accounting of the impacts of U-26 non-directed discard mortality. And what's new here from the agreement we reached last year are the two elements that, that we have made mention of in our comments about the catch limits. The first being the implementation of a rolling 3-year average to calculate the amount of U-26 non-directed discard mortality that we would use as the forecast when calculating TCEYs and other sources of mortality, calculating other sources of mortality in order to reach our TCEYs. So we intend for that 3-year average to be applied for the duration of this agreement until 2022 as the means of doing that calculation. The next piece is the application of 1/2 of the estimated lost yield or harvest opportunity to 2B as a result of non-directed discard mortality or bycatch in Alaskan regulatory areas. So that is also intended to apply through the duration of our agreement until 2022. I think those are the clauses that we wanted to put before you to ensure that there's broad understanding of how our agreement will be reflected in the meeting report that will result from this year's annual meeting. With that, I think I don't have any further comments.
Is that it? Mr. Davis? Thank you for that. And if there are no other comments or questions from commissioners, I believe we will take a morning break and let's shoot for about 15 minutes, 10:35. Oh, sorry, David.
Thank you, Chair. There is just one other element that we'll leave up on the screen over the break, and that is the distributed mortality limits by sector based on the catch sharing plans for each of the contracting parties and the projection of an F42 level of fishing intensity for 2020. So while you take your break, we'll leave this slide up on the screen and it breaks it down based on that overall TCEY limit just adopted by the Commission. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We will take a break until approximately 10:35. All right, let's come back to order, please. Before you go into the next item, Dr. Wilson, I'm just going to take the liberty to make a couple of additional comments relative to the agreement we reached this year. I know that there was some degree of consternation among stakeholders with regard to the agreement we reached last year in terms of the transparency of that. I would like to hope that the way this week progressed this year, we had a high degree of, I guess, stakeholder engagement, cross-pollination amongst the conference board and the PAG and amongst stakeholders to get to the agreement that we reached, and facilitated by a lot of hard work by Dr. Stewart and others. And I just, while some may disagree with how we got to where we landed, I would note that where we landed is very close, almost identical to what was recommended by both the PAG and the conference board. And I would just, I felt like there was a greater degree of at least engagement in the process by which we reached that. And I would just hope that people had a greater comfort level with how we reached our agreement this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Next on the agenda, we have three items remaining, and regarding the media release of the outcomes, I'll pass to the Assistant Director. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So we have prepared already the media release, which will go out today, noting that the annual meeting has been completed. It will include the TCEY limits and the fishing period dates that you just agreed to this morning. And point everybody, of course, to the webpage where all this information will be, as well as the meeting report, which should be published today as well. And we will follow with a more detailed media release within 14 days of the end of the meeting.
Any comments, questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Chair. Next is on the agenda is the election of a chairperson and vice chairperson, noting that in accordance with the rules of procedure, the chairperson and vice chairperson roles are vacated at the end of each commission meeting, and the commission needs to nominate and elect replacement chairs and vice chairs. I will pass the floor back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Look for Mr. Davis.
I'd move to nominate Paul Ryall to be the chairperson for the coming year.
I second that. Any discussion? Is there any objection? Seeing none, congratulations, Mr. Ryall.
Thank you, Chair. The next is the position of Vice Chairperson of the Commission for the subsequent year.
Mr. Alverson.
I would move that Chris Oliver be the vice chair for 2021.
Is there second? Seconded by Mr. Davis. Is there any discussion? Is there any objection? Motion passed.
Thank you, Chair. Next is the adoption of the revised fishery regulations, and I'll again pass to the Assistant Director. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So following on with our discussion from yesterday of the fishery regulations, you approved all of the proposals that you had for consideration at this annual meeting, subject to filling in the final details this morning, which you have done by choosing the TCEY limits as well as the fishing period dates. So we have filled in the table in the fishery limits, and we will work with our agency partners to fill in the second table in the fishery limits, which describes the operation of the catch sharing plans to note the various sector allocations across the IPHC regulatory areas. And we'll confirm those numbers with them before we publish the final version of the fishery regulations. For the benefit of the audience, I will note that the TCEY decisions that you've made and the resulting allocation to the charter recreational fisheries in IPHC regulatory areas 2C and 3A through the operation of the regulatory proposal B1, which you approved yesterday, result in the following charter management measures. So for IPHC regulatory area 2C, the charter management measures for this year are a 1 fish daily bag limit and a reverse slot limit, meaning keep a fish less than or equal to 40 inches or greater than or equal to 80 inches. So it's a 1 fish daily bag limit and the 40-80 slot limit. The management measures which result from the allocation to the charter recreational fishery and IPHC regulatory area 3A are an annual limit of 4 halibut, Pacific halibut per charter angler, a limit of 1 charter trip per vessel per day, a limit of 1 charter trip per charter halibut permit per day, and these are remaining charter management measures from the previous year. Tuesdays and Wednesdays closed to halibut retention all year, a daily bag limit of 2 Pacific halibut, with 1 fish of any size and the 1 fish less than or equal to 26 inches. So noting all the blocks that have been filled in by your actions this morning, as well as the minor editorial changes that have been noted through the course of the meeting, which we have taken both from you and from our agency friends. We will finalize the fishery regulations post haste and publish them no later than the end of the month. And I should note also, for the benefit of everybody, the process by which these regulations come into force in both countries is that the Commission sends them to each contracting party for their adoption and implementation. And so that's the process that takes place. Commission sends the fishery regulations to Canada and the United States, and then they, through their domestic processes, enact them into regulations which apply to the fisheries.
Okay, is there any discussion with regard to this? Okay, thank you, Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Chair. And so that brings us to the close of the formal agenda with the only item remaining, which is the adoption of the report. And so I'll pass back to yourself, Chair, to lay out any process you'd like to follow.
Yeah, I'm assuming that we'll basically recess and allow some time, and I don't know how much time it's going to take. I'm guessing an hour maybe for us to review and finalize the report. And then we would come back into session. I'm gonna guesstimate at noon for what should be a fairly quick final adoption of the report. Does that sound right? Okay, so that'll be the plan. I would, before we do that, and we might lose a lot of some of the audience between now and then, I would offer the opportunity for any commissioners to make any closing comments. Mr. Yamada.
Yeah, as I said, being a recent commissioner, this has been a pretty steep learning curve for me, and I really appreciate the the open discussions we have with the Canadians at these meetings. They've all been very cordial and very open, and I really appreciate that. It's made this position for me, something that I look forward to every year. So I really appreciate that, and the relationship we've developed over the past couple of years. And also, the stakeholders that I've met with out of session, it's really been important for me to get input from stakeholders and informing them about, some of the issues I have in my mind and getting some feedback and keeping them informed and being a little bit more transparent as to, how this process is done. And I do believe that, this is something that I've been, as a stakeholder in the past, always been, I felt was lacking at the commission level. And hopefully I've contributed somewhat this session to having that transparency more available to the stakeholders throughout this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yamada. Mr. Ryall.
Thanks very much. I would echo Commissioner Yamada's comments. I think that over the course of the last couple of years, we've had very fruitful and intense and challenging discussions at the commission level. We heard that as we spoke to the motion around setting TCUI limits this year. I think, though, that what comes out of those discussions is clear direction from the commissioners. We've made efforts to improve upon the transparency over the years of how we arrive at decisions and document those. Commissioner Davis went through a little more detail so that around what is included in the agreement that we came to in 2019. And as Commissioner Oliver identified, efforts were made at this meeting to make sure that there was additional discussion and with respective delegations so that everyone knew what was going on and understanding. And I think with that, we welcome feedback, both positive and negative, hopefully more positive. But we take that into account as we make our decisions, and welcome further dialogue with our respective delegations and hopefully across delegations so that we come to a common understanding of how we're managing the halibut resource. Lastly, I would conclude is that we wouldn't be able to do that without the support of the IPHC Secretariat. Each year we ask them to undertake a lot of work and they always deliver. So just wanted to pass my appreciation on to the staff and Director Dr. Wilson and the Associate Director, Mr. Keith.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ryall. And I'll further echo the comments from Mr. Yamada and Mr. Ryall. Just want to express my great appreciation for the level of input and engagement that we have gotten from all of our stakeholders this week to facilitate the ultimate agreement that we reached, particularly to the IPHC staff. Obviously, Dr. Stewart was a tremendous benefit in that communication and cross-pollination amongst stakeholders in the conference board and the PAG and the commissioners, but not just to single out Dr. Stewart, but others as well. I want to express appreciation for our own U.S. delegation that are sitting behind me and their support for the U.S. commissioners at this meeting, and echo the appreciation for all the Secretariat and yourself, Dr. Wilson, and Mr. Keith. And with that, those are my closing comments, and I'll leave it for you, Dr. Wilson, to have any additional comments.
Thank you, Chair. And my primary aim here is just to echo those last sentiments. It's always a pleasure to work with all of the Secretariat staff who are very much colleagues in the way that we strive to support your needs as a commission and those of all the stakeholders in the room. It's been an immense effort to get to the point of where we have been for this meeting, but even in session, the level of work that is undertaken by the Secretariat staff throughout the day and also through the night in many cases is incredible. Sometimes you wouldn't notice a lot of that work. It just goes on behind the scenes, but I can assure you that there were many staff up all night on a number of occasions to ensure that the conference board and PAB reports were finalized. And as I mentioned, it's the first time that both of those subsidiary bodies have adopted in session in a public forum their own meeting reports. And I think that's quite an achievement. And so again, I'm not going to single out any particular staff. I think it's you've all met most of them. Some of them are new. Some of them have been with us for a very long time. And one of those I'd like to single out is the Assistant Director, Steve Keith. Most of you may know Steve is going to be retiring at the end of March. He's been with the IPHC Secretariat for 8 years after a long stint with the U.S. Navy as a commander. And I just wanted to say publicly that we've appreciated Steve's input and guidance and assistance throughout the IPHC processes over the last 8 years, and he's certainly going to be sorely missed. And so I would ask that we all give Steve a round of applause as we send him off into retirement. And thank you, Steve, very much. Do you want to comment?
Thank you all very much. As you know, we have an amazing staff, so it's been a pleasure to work here. But even more amazing to me has been the whole community, the whole Pacific Halibut community. My first annual meeting was the last time we were here in Anchorage, and I had only been on staff for a month or two. And I was just so amazed by that there were hundreds of people that had gathered that were so well informed and so into what was going on and asked such great questions. And that's part of the reason it's been a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to help the meeting go along and a pleasure to work with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keith. Again, congratulations on your retirement. A lot of us are looking forward to those days at some point. With that, we will recess till approximately for an hour. We'll hopefully plan on coming back at noon to do the final adoption of the report. Thank you. Okay, we'll come back to order and review the meeting report.
Thank you, Chair. So the intention is just to search for the consolidated edits throughout the report rather than going paragraph by paragraph. We'll assume that if there's been no edits to a paragraph, the contracting parties have by default adopted it. It doesn't mean that you can't come back if you think of something as we proceed. So paragraph 1, just an update to the numbers, no particular details there. Paragraph 14 under fishery statistics, Canada has proposed deleting the text in blue, and I'm going to remove that so it's easy to see. It's okay.
I think I'm fine with that. I still have an issue with the table. And I don't know if we suggested an edit to this or not, but I brought this up last year where it's fishery sectors with mortality overages. And in the table, it refers to, in the third column, mortality limit / level, maybe a picayune issue, but the reader could infer from that there is a regulatory limit that's been somehow exceeded when actually these are really comparisons of projected versus actual. And it's a little bit of a perhaps picayune distinction, but there's not, for example, if you look at the very last row for CD&E, it has 1.87 versus the 2.0, which reflects 129% or 29% overage. And it's not an overage relative to some limit that's been exceeded. It's an overage relative to what happened the previous year. And that's my only thing. I just didn't like the term limit in the table as opposed to level. Any particular objection to removing the word limit or not? I'm not going to follow my start over it. Go ahead, Neil.
What if we put limits last projection as the header?
That would, I would agree that would be preferable.
Through the chair, sorry, I missed that comment.
So if you scroll up to the top of the table, you've got headings there, mortality limit / projection. Well, some of them may be limits. These particular ones aren't. But some of them may be. So I think we need to leave the word limit in there in case there are limits that get exceeded, but.
I'm okay. I just had to bring it up again, but I said I'm not gonna delay the process here any further.
Through the chair, one other option is that we just put a symbol as we've done here for the limits and for the projections, and then put that symbol along each one. So that would just mean you'd agree to us doing that. So for example, we would have mortality limit with an asterisk and mortality projection with a symbol, and we would put that symbol or asterisk beside each of these accordingly, just so it's crystal clear which ones are limits and which ones are projections.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll make sure that's in the report. So back to paragraph 14 and the removal of the rounding for the table 1. Are we in agreement?
I don't see any hands up, so I think we can move on.
Paragraph 16, suggested modification. And this is because it's just recalling the recommendation from the last meeting rather than reiterating it in full as though it's a new recommendation.
I think that's an accurate reflection.
Can you just get rid of 1L?
I don't see any objection to that.
Paragraph 17, just an acronym change. Paragraph 19, just a factual change from 1% to 3%, just to represent the actual numbers. Paragraph 21, editorial. Paragraph 22, insertion of the words anticipated to.
We'll give each one a pause, and I don't see any questions or comments or objections. We'll go ahead and move on through. On 24, I don't see any comments. Similarly with 25.
Minor editorial in table 2. Then there was a request to move the new setline survey design to after the recommendation. So it's not changing it, it's just simply moving it down. So it's just flow.
Okay.
Paragraph 28.
Seeing no issues, go ahead.
Paragraph 30.
Okay.
Paragraph 31, the recommendation. So instead of commencing in, which says, it suggests that it's going to continue for a number of years in that format, it's just saying that it's for 1 year.
Okay, that seems consistent with our earlier discussions.
And that's reiterated again by removing the plus sign after 2020 in paragraph 32. Paragraph 34. This was one paragraph and it's been split, and simply noting the additional action.
Okay.
Paragraph 40, there was an editorial within this text. I'm just going to have that verified, noting that this comes out of the stock assessment paper. It was shown as 42 and the edit was to make it 40.2. So we'll just verify that because it's straight out of the assessment paper. And then there was a comment regarding both these two paragraphs with the status of not overfished and not overfishing, and Canada has inserted this additional text.
And I think that additional text is simply a statement of fact that based on what we know now, it's a statement of, I don't have any problem with it.
So the caveat to this is that at the moment we have the 30-20 rule, so the not overfished status is defined. So this is correct. The IPHC doesn't have a specific subject to overfishing ruling. However, we are interpreting it that as a result of not having a specific definition of subject to overfishing or a level, that it's only subject to overfishing if the biomass is below 20%. And that's the application we've been using for a couple of years, but it was just highlighted that it's not, we don't have anything other than that. And so it's a default subject to overfishing level.
And that language at the end of subparagraph B makes that clarification or explanation.
The additional text is clarifying another point, which is factually correct. It's just whether the Commission is still content with us having a default subject to overfishing level, which is tied to the 20%, SB 20%. It's what we've been using, and so it means that anything above that in terms of spawning biomass isn't subject to overfishing at this point because we don't have a specific defined level above that.
And you bring up a point that has been raised, I think, a number of times over the years, certainly in recent years, but is this maybe something that I'm happy with using this as the default, but is this something that should be referred to our science body to help us come up with what would be, from their perspective, a recommended overfishing definition?
That's correct, Chair, and they certainly are looking into it. Just regarding this 40.2, I've just received that it is actually 42, and so I know Canada inserted the 40.2. I just want to confirm that Canada's okay that we go back to the 42. Okay. If you can just delete that. Yeah, yep, perfect. So it is actually 42.
Okay, any further discussion on those paragraphs?
So after paragraph 53, we simply moved the previous paragraph here one forward, so it's just a layout and flow, but then there's an addition to the new paragraph 54.
My understanding of the language in 54 is simply a factual statement per the representation in the paper that we received. Okay.
Okay. Just clarification in 57, but removal of mitigation 4.
I think that's a reflection of our discussions this morning about basically discussing the U-26 adjustments in the context of accounting versus the word mitigation. And there may be one or two other places where we didn't catch that word replacement. Mr. Davis.
Can I just suggest for the readability to say to include accounting for, to include the words accounting for instead of mitigation for?
That would be my preference. Thanks.
Okay. Then there were just some incorrect dates added into the table, so they've just been corrected. And then we have the mitigation word again, and also in a couple of other places.
U-26 accounting, I would suggest we replace the word mitigation with accounting.
A new paragraph inserted at the end of the MSAB section.
Was that edit that you made on Canada? Can you explain, Mr. Davis?
So I think what we had discussed among the commissioners was this idea of we would like the MSAB to start thinking about what work it would do beyond 2021. So part of the request is identify what at least your proposed topics of work would be, if not a detailed work plan. Let us know what your proposed topics of work would be. And based on the discussions we had, I think we are all interested in that work, including the investigation of how we address this issue of mitigating or accounting for the impacts of bycatch in one regulatory area over available harvest in other regulatory areas. So we inserted that here to reflect the interest, I think, that we were hearing from you in that being a subject of study.
In a general context, or more specifically on this U26 context?
In this case, it would be in the context of U26 primarily. I think that was our intent. We didn't, I don't think we put that in, but.
Go ahead, Paul.
Right now, the current work plan stops at the annual meeting next year. And so the thinking was that the U.S. have identified one area, and so there likely will be some other ideas that will come up, and would like to see those documented as Neil has identified as topics, so that we can consider them and develop a more comprehensive work plan.
Okay, with that explanation, I'm okay with this. Oh, yeah, good point. That's part of why I asked this, because I see the mitigating word again. Do you have any issue with using the word accounting for? Okay, thank you.
Okay. In table 6, it's just removing the rounding to minor.
Okay, go ahead.
In paragraph 94 now, it was 91, it's just replacing and standardizing. Instead of using the word bycatch, is using non-directed commercial fisheries, discard mortalities in this case. So we're just standardizing that language throughout.
Neil?
So Adam's just whispered in my ear that we, as a follow-up, I think it would be useful if the staff could ensure that the use of the term interim management procedure is used consistently throughout. I don't really want to try and do that here, but if we could make a note, that would be helpful.
Thank you.
And
I think in a number of places it's called interim harvest policy versus interim management procedure. So we'll standardize it to interim management procedure throughout.
okay.
Again, mitigation. I'll insert.
Yeah,
accounting
before
correct.
accounting
You're
for
right.
U26.
Yeah. Now,
I think everyone understands the intent.
now for D and E, these have been updated from what was presented on the screen this morning to reflect the full components. And so we would just ask the commissioners review those additional components and confirm that they are now comprehensive.
The wording there is just a little awkward, but I think I understand the intent. It's by 50% of the estimated yield loss. Yeah, okay, I'm okay with that. Go ahead, Neil.
One small wording change. I think it's 50% of the estimated yield loss due to U26.
Due to.
DUE. Cool. Okay.
Okay,
Again, just clarification, use of terminology. Correction with the date. We had two 2018s. And just here, I just wanted to highlight as well, Canada had updated these numbers, but we'd highlighted that we'd also had the paragraph about the process for contracting party contributions to be determined internally. And then if the appropriations are lower than the budget, that we would need to meet intersessionally to revise the budget down. And that applies not only for 2021, but also with that same paragraph being inserted for 2022. And then while we have these on screen, new paragraph 129 and 130 have been updated.
okay. I'm sorry, could you go back to 130?
Sorry.
131. Okay,
Tables 8 was changed from the Processor Advisory Board recommendation essentially to a proposed TCEY, and that's because there was no agreement. So it's just wording.
okay.
And that's it. That is the main report. We'll be updating the list of attendees. And we also corrected the work meeting in the calendar as tentative dates because we agreed to modify that. And we've included the 18th, 19th of November for the interim meeting this year as proposed, and we can certainly implement that. So Chair, that's the completion of the report. And if commissioners are in agreement, we could move to adopt the final paragraph, which is to adopt the report today, the 7th of February, 2020.
Yeah, I guess I'll look for a motion. Mr. Ryall.
Yes, I make a motion to adopt the report.
Seconded by Mr. Alverson. Any further discussion? Any objection? Okay, that passes.
Adopted. That's all. Thank you very much, Chair.
One moment, Mr. Ryall.
I was wondering if we could see if we could schedule the intersessional meeting that we spoke of while we're all here.
Can we bring up a calendar maybe on the screen? If the Secretary could save this first as adopted, and then if we could bring a calendar up on the screen, please.
Are we anticipating that to be an in-person or a teleconference meeting?
No, I was thinking that we'd do it by teleconference.
Okay.
I was wondering if there's time in February.
Would it be a day-long meeting, you think?
I don't think so, but maybe 3 hours,
Oh,
maybe plenty.
Figure maybe half a day.
Yeah. Well, let's put together an agenda, but I suspect at the most 2 hours.
That'll make it easier.
While you're looking at your calendars, if we could have a calendar up on the screen for February, just the month of February, please. And very briefly, as far as I can recall, the two key agenda items are a discussion around the Management Strategy Advisory Board and the MSE recommendations, and also the financial regulations, the two items that I can recall to be added to that intersessional meeting. No, sorry, if I could just have a calendar of February, please, on the screen.
I, yeah, that we're available. And I'm looking, go ahead, Bob.
The first week of March, I'm at I have a 3-day dance with the Pacific Council.
Do you have any time in February, Bob?
That's in March. Yeah, I do have time in February. Just
Yeah.
about any time.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking at my calendar right now. I think I see some time on the, so where of course we'll have to deal with a time difference too. Hate to suggest this, but I might suggest consideration of Monday, February 17th, which is a federal holiday, but it's the only day on my calendar I have any time available. I could make that work.
Yeah, I have a commitment
That works
day.
for me.
I have a commitment that day. The 17th, yeah.
Yeah, I can too.
While that's being investigated, just to give an indication that Dr. Hicks will be on leave from the 18th for the rest of that week. So if we wanted to discuss MSE, we'd need to do it on the 17th or the following week.
The 25th is another option. And the 27th is a potential option. And I guess 25th, 27th would work for me.
27 works for me.
Okay, Neil can't do either of those days, it sounds like. Neil can't do either of those days.
I
Can you
can do the 17th, but I can't do the 25th or the 27th.
All right, well, I'm willing to do the 17th.
It works for all three of us.
17th, yeah, I'm not available that day, but I'm not available on that day. I
Oh.
have an engagement on. Can we make it the week before that? Is that enough time? Next week?
I'm not available.
No. So, okay, we're into March.
March 3rd.
Yep.
I can call in. I mean, it's going to be a phone call anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'll call in from down there. Their secretary will provide me something.
I can make March 3rd work. All right, I think we have a winner.
There we go.
Morning, afternoon. I can do both, but let's lock it down.
Afternoon, your time would be evening, my time. I would say morning, your time, which makes it afternoon, my time.
Sure. So, 10 till noon? 9? Okay, we'll say 9 to noon, but likely it'll be 9 to 11.
All right.
Thank Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I would just like to say once again, thanks to all the Secretariat support. Thanks to my colleagues across the table for our cordial and productive discussions. And with that, we will adjourn.